The most dangerous man in the city had a single, devastating weakness, and she was currently placing a cup of coffee on his desk, completely unaware that she held his heart in her hands and his life in the balance. The world knew him as Mark Park, a title spoken in hushed, fearful tones from the glittering high-rises to the rain-slicked, neon-drenched alleys of the city. As the head of the White Tiger Syndicate, his life was a meticulously curated tapestry of violence, luxury, and absolute control. His penthouse office, perched like an obsidian crown atop the Azure Tower, was a testament to this. Floor-to-ceiling windows showcased the sprawling metropolis, a kingdom he ruled from the shadows. The air was cold, scentless, carrying the weight of unspoken threats and multi-million-dollar deals. Mark stood at the window, his silhouette a sharp cutout against the city lights. He was a man carved from granite and silence, his black tailored suit fitting him like a second skin of authority. His eyes, dark and impossibly still, watched the world below, but his attention was fractured. The low, respectful hum of his inner circle, his trusted lieutenants Jay and Minute discussing a territorial dispute with the rival Jade Dragons, was just background noise. His entire focus was tuned to a single, gentle sound: the soft click-clack of heels on polished marble approaching his office door. The door opened without a sound, and she entered. Lucy Alexandra. To his men, she was simply the new office manager, efficient, irreproachable, and hauntingly beautiful. To Mark, she was a seismic event in human form. Today, she wore a simple but elegant navy blue dress that hugged her slender frame, a stark contrast to the sterile opulence of his world. Her hair was braided into an intricate crown that framed a face of such serene, unassuming beauty it made his chest ache. She carried a tablet in one hand and a porcelain cup of coffee in the other. Black, 2 sugars, the way he'd only ever told her he liked it once. "Your 10:30 meeting has been pushed back by 15 minutes, Mr. Park." Her voice was calm, melodic, a balm to the constant tension that coiled within him. She placed the coffee on his desk, the china making a soft clink that echoed in the silent room. "And the financial reports from the Singapore holdings are ready for your review." He didn't turn, couldn't risk her seeing the storm in his eyes. He simply gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture his men understood as dismissal. But for her, it was a mask, a desperate attempt to maintain the facade of the untouchable boss. "Thank you, Lucy," he said, his voice low, betraying none of the chaos she ignited within him. As she turned to leave, his eyes, reflected in the window, followed her every movement. He watched the way a stray curl had escaped her braid to kiss the nape of her neck. He watched the confident, graceful sway of her retreat, a quiet dignity that seemed utterly alien in his world of brutality. The door clicked shut, and the room felt instantly colder, emptier. Jay, ever perceptive, narrowed his eyes, glancing from the closed door to his boss's rigid back. "She's good. Efficient. Better than the last one." Mark finally turned, his face an unreadable mask. "She's an employee. Nothing more." The lie tasted like ash. He walked to his desk, his movements lethally controlled, and picked up the coffee. He took a sip, the rich, bitter flavor a tangible connection to her. It was a ritual, a secret intimacy he allowed himself each day. Later, as Lucy prepared to leave for the evening, a sudden, torrential downpour lashed against the tower windows. Mark watched from the shadows of his office as she stood in the lobby, staring out at the impenetrable curtain of water, a slight frown on her face. He knew she took the bus. He knew she had no umbrella. A dangerous, impulsive thought, utterly foreign to his calculated nature, took root. He could offer her a ride in his armored Maybach. He could have the immense, unspoken privilege of sitting beside her in the quiet, enclosed space, to smell the faint scent of shea butter and vanilla that always lingered in her wake. His fingers tightened around the edge of his desk. It was a risk he could not take. Showing favoritism was a vulnerability. His enemies watched his every move, and an innocent like Lucy would be the perfect target. She was a spot of pure light in his world of shadows, and he knew, with a chilling certainty, that to draw her into his orbit was to risk extinguishing that light forever. He made his decision. He would remain in the shadows, as always. He watched her take a deep breath and step out into the storm, her figure quickly swallowed by the rain and the city's gloom. But as Mark turned away from the window, a cold dread settled in his stomach. Parked across the street, a sleek, black sedan with tinted windows he didn't recognize idled, its presence feeling less like a coincidence and more like a predator lying in wait. It pulled away from the curb a moment later, slipping into the traffic, but the message was received. Someone was watching, and they had just seen his greatest weakness walk out into the night, completely unprotected. Lucy has stepped out into the storm, unaware she's being watched, and Mark is now faced with the terrifying realization that his secret admiration may have just put her directly in the crosshairs of an unseen enemy. The rain was a relentless, drumming fury, turning the city into a watercolor blur of smeared neon and trembling streetlights. Lucy Alexandra pulled her thin coat tighter, a futile gesture against the icy needles of water. The bus stop was a block away, but it felt like a mile. She hunched her shoulders, her leather flats already soaked through, and began to walk, the city's roar muffled by the downpour. From the obsidian heights of his office, Mark Park tracked her progress, his knuckles white as they pressed against the cold glass. Every instinct, every hardened fiber of his being, screamed at him to act, to call her back, to send a car, to do something. But the memory of that black sedan, a venomous silhouette in the rain, held him frozen. Acknowledging her now would be like painting a target on her back. His protection, once given, was a curse as much as a shield. His phone, a secure, encrypted device, vibrated on the desk. He snatched it up, his voice a low growl. "Jay." The car across the street. "Did you get a plate?" "Partial." Jay's voice was tense, crackling through the line. "It was a rental. Clean. Too clean." "They were professionals, boss." Mark's jaw tightened. "Find them. I want to know who sent them before the hour is out." He ended the call, his gaze snapping back to the window. Lucy was just a small, dark shape now, nearly at the corner. His heart hammered a violent, unfamiliar rhythm against his ribs. This was a new kind of torture, a helplessness he hadn't felt since he was a boy. Down on the street, Lucy finally reached the relative shelter of the bus stop, shivering as water dripped from her braids. She hugged her arms around herself, trying to conserve warmth. A sleek, black town car, different from the one Mark had seen, but similarly ominous, slowed as it passed her. It didn't stop, but the passenger window slid down a fraction. For a heart-stopping second, she felt the weight of a gaze, cold and assessing, before the car accelerated and disappeared into the gloom. A prickle of unease, sharp and cold, ran down her spine. It was probably nothing, just a coincidence. This city was full of expensive cars. But the feeling lingered, a stark contrast to the usual anonymity she felt here. Back in the penthouse, Mark's phone buzzed again. "Minute Ho this time." "Boss, we have a problem. The Jade Dragons. They're making a move on the docks tonight. They're testing us." The underworld was stirring, a beast sensing weakness. Mark's face hardened, the concerned man replaced by the ruthless boss. The dragons were a distraction, a noise in the system, but a dangerous one. They needed to be reminded of their place with swift, brutal force. But his mind was split, a chessboard with two simultaneous, deadly games. One involved containers, territory, and blood. The other involved a woman waiting for a bus in the rain. "Assemble the men," Mark commanded, his voice dropping to a deadly calm. "We'll meet them at the docks. But first, I have a different errand." He disconnected, striding to his private elevator. The decision was made. The calculated risk was now a necessary one. He descended to the underground garage where his driver, a mountain of a man named Kim, stood waiting by the open door of the Maybach. "The usual route home, sir?" Kim asked. "No," Mark said, sliding into the plush interior. "One block east. The bus stop on Grand." The car glided through the flooded streets, a phantom in the storm. Within minutes, they turned the corner. And there she was. Lucy, looking smaller and more vulnerable than he could have imagined, her clothes plastered to her, her arms wrapped around herself for warmth. The sight was a physical blow. The Maybach pulled smoothly to the curb beside her. The tinted rear window slid down silently. Lucy flinched, taking a step back, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and confusion until they focused on the man inside. Mark's face was partially shadowed, the interior lights catching the sharp line of his jaw. The storm raged behind him, a fitting backdrop. "Get in," he said, his voice not leaving room for argument. It was not the gentle offer he had imagined earlier. It was a command, laced with an urgency she couldn't possibly understand. Lucy stared, frozen. This was her reclusive, terrifying boss. The man whose very name was synonymous with power and danger. Getting into his car felt like crossing a line from which there was no return. The safe, ordinary world of her 9-to-5 job was crumbling around her. I couldn't impose, Mr. Park," she stammered, her voice barely audible over the rain. "The bus will be here soon." Mark's eyes, dark and intense, held hers. He could see the wariness in her gaze, the intelligent fear. He respected it. But he also knew the black sedan was still out there, somewhere in the labyrinth of the city. Letting her stand here alone was no longer an option. "The bus isn't coming," he said, the lie coming easily. "The line is flooded 3 blocks down. Get in. Now." The final word was soft, but it carried the weight of all his authority. It was a tone that brooked no disobedience, a tone that made men twice her size fall silent. Her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, her mind screaming in protest, Lucy Alexandra looked from his implacable face to the drowning city around her, and with a trembling hand, she reached for the door handle, the decision made not by logic, but by the primal instinct to seek shelter from the storm, unaware that she was stepping out of the rain and directly into the eye of a different, far more dangerous hurricane. The car door closed with a soft, definitive thud, sealing her inside with the most dangerous man in the city, just as a pair of headlights flicked on in the distance, watching them drive away into the night. The interior of the Maybach was a tomb of silence, broken only by the muted percussion of the rain against the armored windows. The air was cool, scentless, and carried the faint, expensive aroma of leather and ozone. Lucy sat as far from Mark as the spacious seat allowed, her wet clothes feeling absurdly out of place against the immaculate, cream-colored upholstery. She kept her gaze fixed on the water-streaked city sliding by, a kaleidoscope of blurred light and shadow. Mark watched her from his side of the car, his posture deceptively relaxed. He could see the rapid flutter of the pulse at the base of her throat, the white-knuckled grip she had on her damp handbag. She was terrified. Of him. The realization was a bitter pill. He, who commanded armies of hardened men, who could silence a room with a glance, had reduced this vibrant, intelligent woman to a state of frightened silence. "Your address," he said, his voice quieter than he intended, an attempt to sand the sharp edges off his authority. She flinched, just slightly, before reciting it in a hushed tone. He relayed it to Kim through the intercom, his eyes never leaving her profile. The car navigated the slick streets with a ghost's grace. "Thank you," Lucy whispered after a moment, forcing the words out. "For the ride." She still didn't look at him. "It was no trouble," he replied, the understatement of the century. His entire world had just been tilted on its axis for this single car ride. A sudden, violent shiver racked her body, her teeth chattering softly. The sight undid him. Without a word, Mark shrugged out of his tailored jacket, a garment worth more than her monthly rent. The movement was fluid, practiced. He leaned over and draped it around her shoulders. Lucy froze, her eyes widening as she finally turned to look at him. The weight of the wool was immense, both physically and symbolically. It was still warm from his body and carried his scent. Sandalwood, clean linen, and something else, something uniquely, dangerously him. "Mr. Park, I couldn't." "You're cold," he stated, his voice leaving no room for argument. His fingers, as he adjusted the collar near her neck, brushed against the damp skin of her shoulder for a fleeting second. A jolt, electric and undeniable, shot through both of them. Lucy's breath hitched, her gaze locking with his. In the dim light of the car, his eyes weren't just dark. They were deep, swirling with emotions she couldn't name: protectiveness, desire, and a haunting sadness. This wasn't the look of a ruthless crime lord. This was the look of a man. For Mark, that brief touch was a brand. Her skin was cooler than his, soft as silk. The connection, though momentary, was more intimate than any kiss he'd ever shared. It shattered the careful walls he'd built around his feelings. He saw the confusion in her eyes, the flicker of something other than fear, curiosity, perhaps. A silent acknowledgement of the current that had just arced between them. He pulled his hand back as if burned, retreating to his side of the car. The space between them now felt charged, crackling with unspoken words and a dangerous, burgeoning attraction. "You should be careful," he said, his gaze returning to the window, the boss reasserting himself over the man. "The city is unpredictable at night." "I am always careful, Mr. Park," she replied, her voice a little stronger now, her fingers unconsciously tightening around the lapels of his jacket, pulling it closer. He almost smiled. "You have no idea," he thought. "No idea that your careful world is about to be shattered because of me." The car eventually pulled up to her modest apartment building, a stark contrast to the fortress he called home. "Thank you again," she said, quickly shrugging off his jacket and handing it back to him, her fingers careful not to touch his. "I'll see you tomorrow." He simply nodded, watching as she fled from the car and into the relative safety of her lobby. He held the jacket in his hands, still warm from her body, now mingled with the scent of her vanilla and the rain. It was a tangible piece of her, a secret he would carry back into his world of shadows. As the Maybach pulled away, Kim's voice came through the intercom, grim and steady. "Boss, we identified the men watching the office. They're definitely Jade Dragons. Intel suggests they were doing reconnaissance, not just on the business, but on personnel. They've been compiling dossiers." Mark's blood ran cold. Dossiers. That meant names, addresses, routines. Her name. Her address. The romantic tension of moments ago evaporated, replaced by a glacial, murderous fear. He had not pulled her from the storm. He had merely brought the eye of the hurricane to her doorstep. He looked down at his jacket, then back at her now distant apartment building, a grim resolution settling on his features. The Jade Dragons had just made their move, and in doing so, they had signed their own death warrants, because Mark Park now had something truly worth killing for, and he would burn the entire city to the ground before he let them touch her. The game had changed, and the next move would be his, a move of blood and fire. The scent of her was still on his jacket. Sandalwood and vanilla, now forever intertwined in his mind with the cold, metallic smell of rain and fear. Mark stood in the center of his penthouse, a cavern of glass and steel that felt more like a cage than a home. He had shed his tie, and the top buttons of his shirt were open, a small concession to the turmoil raging inside him. In his hand, he held a crystal tumbler of amber whiskey, but he didn't drink. He was too busy planning the annihilation of the Jade Dragons. Jay and Minute Ho stood before him, their faces grim in the low light. The intelligence was damning. The dragons had photos. They had shift patterns. They had identified Lucy not as a random employee, but as the one person who entered Mark's inner sanctum alone, multiple times a day. "They see a vulnerability," Minute Ho said, his voice tight. "They think she's your favorite." The word hung in the air, ugly and dangerous. Mark's knuckles turned white around the glass. "They see a ghost," he corrected, his voice dangerously soft. "And they are chasing a phantom that will get them all killed." He set the tumbler down with a sharp click. "I want their leadership. I want the heads of their intelligence unit. I want the photographer. I want them to understand that even looking in her direction is a death sentence." The orders were given with a chilling finality. His men nodded, their eyes gleaming with the prospect of violence. This was a language they understood. But as they turned to leave, Mark added one more command, one that had nothing to do with war and everything to do with a secret he could no longer afford to keep. "And Jay," he said, "I want a detail on her. 24 hours. Ghosts. I don't want her to even suspect she's being watched." Jay's eyebrows rose a fraction, but he simply nodded. "Understood, boss. The next morning, Lucy arrived at work feeling unsettled. The memory of the car ride played on a loop in her mind. The intensity of his gaze, the shocking warmth of his touch, the heavy weight of his jacket. She'd replayed his warning about the city being unpredictable a dozen times. Was it a general caution, or something more? The office felt different. The usual quiet hum was charged with a new tension. When she brought Mark his morning coffee, he was standing by the window, just as he had been the day before. But today, he turned as she entered. "Lucy," he said, her name a low rumble in the quiet room. "Your coffee, Mr. Park," she said, placing it on the desk, her movements careful. He didn't acknowledge the coffee. His eyes scanned her face, looking for signs of fear, of unease. "Did you get home all right? After the rain?" The question was so personal, so utterly divorced from their professional dynamic, that it stole her breath. "Yes. Thank you again." He took a step closer, and the air in the room seemed to thin. He was close enough that she could see the flecks of silver in his dark eyes, the faint shadow of stubble along his jaw. This city, it can be dangerous for those who are noticed. He chose his words with the care of a man defusing a bomb. "If you ever feel unsafe, if anyone ever approaches you, you tell me. Immediately." It was no longer a vague warning. It was a specific, direct offer of protection. Lucy's heart hammered against her ribs. This was not about a boss caring for an employee's well-being. This was something else, something darker and more profound. The power imbalance between them had never felt so vast, or so terrifyingly intimate. "Why?" The question slipped out, a whisper of pure, unadulterated curiosity and fear. Mark's gaze dropped to her lips for a heartbeat, so fast she thought she might have imagined it. 1,000 answers warred within him, confessions, threats, promises. But the boss won. The mask of control slid back into place. "Because you are my employee," he said, his voice turning cool and distant once more, the moment shattered. "And I protect what is mine." He turned back to the window, a clear dismissal. Lucy stood there for a moment, stunned, before fleeing the office. "I protect what is mine." The words echoed in her head. They should have felt possessive, chauvinistic. So why did a treacherous, secret part of her feel a thrill at the possessiveness in his tone? She didn't see the flicker of regret and raw hunger that crossed Mark's face the second the door closed. He had come too close, said too much. He had let the monster of his desire peek out from its cage, and he had seen the answering flicker of something in her eyes that wasn't just fear. It was the beginning of a connection, a thread of understanding spun in the space between a warning and a confession. And he knew, with a terrifying certainty, that the next time he stood this close to her, he wouldn't be able to pull away, and the carefully constructed wall between the boss and the man would crumble into dust, leaving only the raw, dangerous truth of his desire for her exposed for them both to see. The following week was a study in exquisite tension. The air in the Azure Tower seemed to crackle with it. For Lucy, every interaction with Mark was now layered with a subtext she couldn't decipher. His protection was a palpable, unseen force. A new security guard was posted in the lobby who nodded to her with a strange deference. On her bus ride home, a nondescript sedan seemed to always be a few cars behind, disappearing when she reached her street. She felt both safer and more trapped than ever before. For Mark, it was a special kind of hell. Conducting business from his throne of power while a part of his mind was always with her, tracking her movements through the building via the security feeds he had pulled up on a private monitor. He saw her laugh with the old janitor, saw her frown in concentration over spreadsheets, saw the quiet grace with which she moved through her day, a beacon of light in his kingdom of shadows. The war with the Jade Dragons was escalating into bloody, clandestine skirmishes at the docks and in back-alley gambling dens, all fought over the unspoken principle of her safety. It all came to a head on a Thursday evening. Lucy was working late, finalizing a complex shipment ledger. The rest of the floor was empty, silent except for the hum of the servers. Mark had been in a closed-door meeting with his lieutenants for hours, the low, angry tones occasionally leaking through the heavy door. Suddenly, the door to his office burst open. Jay and Minute Ho strode out, their faces like stone, not even glancing at her as they headed for the elevator. The tension they left in their wake was thick enough to taste. A moment later, Mark appeared in his doorway. He looked unraveled. His tie was gone, his shirt sleeves were rolled up to his elbows, revealing the stark, black lines of tattoos on his forearms, a glimpse of the savage world he usually kept hidden from her. His hair was disheveled as if he'd been running his hands through it repeatedly. And in his eyes, she saw a storm of fury and something else, something raw and desperate. "Lucy," he said, his voice gravelly. A moment. Her heart leaped into her throat. She stood, smoothing her skirt nervously, and walked into his office. He closed the door behind her, the soft click sounding as final as a gunshot. The room was filled with the remnants of his rage. A chair was knocked over, a glass lay shattered by the wet bar. He didn't seem to notice. He paced to the window, his back to her, his shoulders rigid. "Is everything all right, Mr. Park?" she asked, her voice small in the vast, tense space. He let out a short, humorless laugh. "No, everything is not all right." He turned to face her, and the full force of his gaze pinned her in place. "They touched something of mine tonight. Something they had no right to even look at." He was talking about the dragons, she realized, but the ferocity in his voice felt personal. It felt directed at her. I'm sorry," she whispered, unsure of what else to say. "Don't be sorry," he commanded, taking a step toward her. The space between them evaporated. She could see the pulse hammering in his throat, smell the faint scent of whiskey and his sandalwood cologne. "This world, my world, is a filthy, violent place. It's everything you are not. And I have tried. God, I have tried to keep you separate from it." Another step. She should have been terrified. But the fear was now inextricably tangled with a powerful, magnetic pull. He was close enough to touch. "Why?" she breathed, repeating her question from days before. But this time it was a challenge, a demand for the truth he was so desperately hiding. That was the question that broke him. The careful control he had maintained for weeks, for years, shattered. "You know why," he growled, the words ripped from the depths of his soul. His hand came up, not to hurt, but to cradle her face. His touch was surprisingly gentle, his thumb stroking her cheekbone, a shocking contrast to the violence simmering in his eyes. Lucy's breath caught. Every rational thought screamed at her to run, but her body was rooted to the spot, leaning into his touch. And then he kissed her. It wasn't gentle or questioning. It was acclaiming. A release of months of pent-up longing, a desperate collision of two worlds that were never meant to meet. His lips were firm and demanding, yet there was a startling vulnerability in the way his hand trembled against her cheek. Lucy's mind went blank. For a single, breathtaking second, she kissed him back, her hands coming up to clutch at the fabric of his shirt, surrendering to the tidal wave of sensation. It was fire and ice, danger and salvation, all at once. But as quickly as it began, it ended. Mark pulled back as if she had burned him, his eyes wide with shock and horror at his own loss of control. He stared at her kiss-swollen lips and dazed expression, and the reality of what he had done, the danger he had just exposed her to, crashed down on him. He took a staggering step back, his face a mask of torment. "Get out," he rasped, the words laced with self-loathing. Lucy, her entire world redefined by that one searing kiss, could only stare, her heart pounding a frantic, confused rhythm. She turned and fled from the office, the taste of him, whiskey, power, and desperate want, still on her lips, leaving Mark alone in the ruins of his control, knowing he had crossed a line from which there was no return, and that the consequences of his heart's fatal weakness would now be paid in blood. The kiss had been the beginning of everything, and he was deathly afraid it would also be the end. Lucy didn't sleep. She lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, her lips still tingling with the ghost of his kiss. The memory played over and over, the raw hunger in his eyes, the shocking gentleness of his hand, the devastating pressure of his mouth on hers. It should have felt like a violation, an abuse of his power. But the echo of her own response, the way her body had arched into his, the way her fingers had clung to his shirt, It terrified her. She was attracted to the danger. She was drawn to the storm. The next morning, the walk to the bus stop felt like a march to the gallows. What would she say? What would he do? The professional facade they had maintained was incinerated, leaving only the smoking crater of that kiss. When she arrived at the Azure Tower, the air was different. The usual security guard was replaced by two new, stone-faced men who watched her with an unsettling intensity. The elevator ride to the penthouse was an eternity. She stepped out, her heart in her throat, and found the office door ajar. Mark was at his desk, but he was not the same man from the night before. He was the Mafia boss again, impeccably dressed in a charcoal gray suit, his face a mask of impenetrable ice. But the shadows under his eyes betrayed his own sleepless night. He didn't look up as she entered. "Lucy," he said, his voice clipped and devoid of all emotion. "The quarterly financials for the shell corporations in Zurich. I need them compiled and on my desk by noon." It was a dismissal. A brutal, effective one. He was re-establishing the distance, building the wall higher and thicker than ever before. The kiss was being treated as an anomaly, a moment of madness to be buried and forgotten. A strange, sharp pain lanced through her chest. "Of course, Mr. Park," she managed to say, her own voice sounding hollow. She turned to leave, the rejection stinging more than the kiss itself. "Lucy." She froze, her hand on the doorframe. His next words were so quiet she almost missed them, but they were laced with a steel that made her blood run cold. "What happened last night was a mistake. It will not happen again. For your own safety, you will forget it. Do you understand?" He finally looked up, and the message in his eyes was clear. This wasn't a rejection born of disinterest. It was a strategic retreat. He was pushing her away to protect her. The kiss had been a catastrophic security breach, and he was now in full damage control mode. The realization should have comforted her. It didn't. It made everything more terrifyingly real. His world wasn't just dangerous. It was so perilous that even a moment of human weakness could have fatal consequences. "I understand," she whispered, and fled to the sanctuary of her own desk, her mind reeling. For the rest of the day, they moved around each other like ghosts. When she brought him documents, he wouldn't meet her eye. His orders were polite, professional, and utterly freezing. The warmth, the lingering glances, the subtle tension, all of it was gone, replaced by a chasm of purposeful distance. It was worse than the tension. This felt like a funeral for something that had never even had a chance to live. That evening, as Lucy packed her bag, her phone buzzed with an unknown number. A text message. "Unknown number. You shouldn't have let him touch you. Now you're part of the game. Watch your back." A cold dread, sharper than any she had ever known, seized her. She dropped her phone as if it had burned her, her eyes darting around the empty office. They were watching. They knew. The Jade Dragons knew about the kiss. Mark's coldness wasn't a rejection. It was a quarantine. He had tried to push her away to make her seem unimportant, but it was too late. The damage was done. The kiss had branded her as his, and in the brutal logic of his world, that made her a prime target. She was no longer just an employee. She was a weapon to be used against Mark Park, and the war for the city had just become a war for her life, a war she had been drafted into with a single, fateful kiss. The text message was a shard of ice in her veins. Lucy stood frozen in the empty office, the hum of the computers suddenly sounding like a predator's whisper. "Watch your back." They knew. They knew about the kiss. They knew where she worked. Her phone, with its terrifying message, felt like a live grenade in her hand. Panic was a cold, rising tide. Her first, primal instinct was to run to him, to Mark. But the memory of his icy demeanor, his command to forget it, stopped her. He had pushed her away for this exact reason. Going to him now would only prove to his enemies that she was his weakness. But she couldn't do nothing. Clutching her phone, she did the only thing that felt safe. She ran. Not to Mark's office, but out of the building, down to the bustling street below, losing herself in the crowd, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm of pure fear. High above, Mark was in his war room, a secure chamber adjacent to his office lined with monitors showing live feeds from all over the city. Jay was pointing to a map. They've moved their operation to the old fish market warehouses. They're getting bold. Mark's phone, a different, private line, vibrated. He glanced at it, expecting an update from another lieutenant. It was a message from an encrypted number, but the content was not from his man. It was a forwarded image. A photo of Lucy, taken just minutes ago, leaving the Azure Tower, her face pale and frightened. The message below was simple. She's pretty when she's scared. We'll take good care of her. A red haze descended over Mark's vision. The cool, calculating boss vanished. In his place was something primal, a beast whose sole possession had been threatened. The room's temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Jay, Mark's voice was a low, deadly whisper that promised carnage. They just sent me a picture of Lucy. Jay's face hardened. It's a provocation. They want you to make a reckless move. Oh, I will, Mark said, his eyes burning with a cold fire. But it won't be reckless. It will be surgical. He began issuing commands, his voice chillingly calm. Pull every asset we have off the docks. I want a 10-man team on her apartment. Now. I want their warehouses surrounded. No one gets in or out. He picked up his personal phone, the one he used only for her. His fingers, for the first time, trembled as he typed. Mark, where are you? The response was immediate, laced with panic. Lucy, on a bus. I'm scared. They texted me. His heart clenched. He had done this. His desire had painted a target on her back. The kiss, the one moment of pure, unadulterated feeling he had allowed himself, had become her death sentence. Mark, get off at the next stop. Look for a black SUV. A man named Kim will be there. Get in the car, Lucy. Do not argue. Do not go home. This was it. The point of no return. By sending his most trusted driver, he was openly declaring to the entire underworld that Lucy Alexandra was under the direct protection of the White Tiger. There would be no more hiding, no more professional distance. The secret was out, and the war was now, irrevocably, about her. Down in the city, Lucy read the text, her breath catching. The bus hissed to a stop. Through the window, she saw it. The same black Maybach from the night in the rain, idling at the curb like a panther. Kim stood by the open door, his expression grim but not unkind. This was the choice. Step into the car, into his world completely, and accept whatever protection, and whatever danger, that came with it. Or stay on the bus, alone and exposed. With a final, trembling breath, Lucy Alexandra stood up and walked off the bus, her decision made not out of fear, but out of a startling, clear-eyed trust for the man who had just thrown his entire empire into chaos for her. As the car door closed, sealing her inside, she didn't know that Mark was already strapping on a bulletproof vest, his eyes fixed on the warehouse district on the monitor, his heart a drumbeat of vengeance, because the Jade Dragons had made their final, fatal mistake. They had threatened what was his, and Mark Park was now coming for them, not as a businessman, but as an executioner, and the city would run red with their blood before the night was through. The Maybach did not take her to her apartment. It glided through the city, a shark moving through dark water, and pulled into the underground garage of a sleek, anonymous high-rise she didn't recognize. Kim escorted her to a private elevator that required a retinal scan to activate. It ascended to the penthouse without stopping. When the doors opened, Lucy stepped into a different world. This was not Mark's corporate fortress of glass and steel. This was his home. The space was vast, but surprisingly warm, decorated in tones of charcoal and cream. A floor-to-ceiling aquarium filled one wall, casting a soft, blue glow over plush sofas and shelves lined with books, real books, not just for show. It was a sanctuary, a hidden piece of the man behind the boss. "Wait here, Miss Lucy," Kim said, his voice gentle. "You will be safe. No one knows about this place." He left her alone. The silence was profound. Lucy wrapped her arms around herself, standing in the center of the living room, the events of the day crashing down on her. The threatening text. The terrifying photo. the frantic escape. And now, this, the inner sanctum of Mark Park. She walked to the aquarium, watching the exotic fish drift serenely in their silent, protected world. It was a stark contrast to the violence she knew was unfolding somewhere out in the city because of her. Her gaze fell on a single, framed photograph on a nearby shelf. It was a younger Mark, perhaps in his late teens, his arm around an older man who shared his eyes. He was smiling, a real, unguarded smile she had never seen. Her heart ached for that boy, for the man he had to become. Meanwhile, in the industrial wasteland of the docks, the surgical strike had begun. Mark, clad in black tactical gear, moved like a phantom through the labyrinth of corrugated metal and rusting shipping containers. His men were shadows, flanking him, their movements silent and precise. The air stank of salt, rot, and impending death. They cornered the Jade Dragon's lieutenant, a man named Chen, in a warehouse office lit by a single, swinging bulb. Chen was smug, arrogant, surrounded by his own men. "Park," Chen sneered. "Come to negotiate? Your woman must be very special to bring you out here yourself." Mark didn't speak. He didn't negotiate. He simply raised his pistol and shot Chen's chief enforcer in the knee. The man screamed, collapsing to the concrete floor. The sound echoed in the cavernous space. "I am not here to negotiate," Mark said, his voice flat, devoid of all emotion. "I am here to deliver a message. You look at her, you lose your eyes. You text her, you lose your hands. You speak her name," he paused, his gaze sweeping over the terrified men. "You lose your tongue. And if any of you come within a mile of her, I will wipe your entire bloodline from this city." He lowered his gun, his message delivered. It was not a threat. It was a prophecy. The raw, terrifying power he radiated cowed the hardened gangsters into silence. They saw the truth in his eyes. This was not a business dispute. This was a crusade. Back in the penthouse, Lucy heard the soft chime of the elevator. She spun around, her heart in her throat. Mark stepped out. He had shed the tactical vest, but he still wore the black clothing. He smelled of night air, gunpowder, and cold rage. There was a fresh cut on his knuckles, and his eyes held the distant, haunted look of a man who had just returned from a dark place. For a long moment, they just stared at each other across the luxurious room. The boss and the employee were gone. The pretense was gone. All that remained was a man and a woman, bound together by a dangerous secret and a single, searing kiss. "It's done," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "They won't bother you again." The finality in his tone sent a shiver through her. She knew what done meant in his world. She should have been horrified, but all she felt was a profound, shocking sense of safety. This dangerous, violent man had crossed into hell and back tonight to create a safe circle around her. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Yes," he said, taking a slow step toward her, his intense gaze holding hers captive. "I did." He stopped just in front of her, close enough for her to see the flecks of silver in his dark, weary eyes, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body. The air crackled with the memory of their kiss and the unspoken truth of what he had just done for her. "I have spent my entire life building walls," he confessed, his voice low and raw. "Walls of power, of fear, of money. To keep people out. To keep myself in." His eyes searched hers, full of a vulnerability she had never seen before. "But you walked through them all like they were never even there." Lucy's breath caught. This was the real Mark Park. Not the Mafia boss, but the man trapped inside. The man who read books and loved fish and had once known how to smile. The man who was looking at her now as if she were his only anchor in a stormy sea. He raised his hand, his fingers gently brushing a stray tear from her cheek that she hadn't even realized she'd shed. The touch was so tender it shattered her completely. "The moment you walked into my office," he whispered, "was the moment my world ended and began." And as he stood there, his heart utterly defenseless before her, Lucy knew the most dangerous thing of all was no longer the rival gangs or the threats in the dark. It was the terrifying, beautiful, and undeniable truth that she was falling in love with him, and that this confession in the quiet of his sanctuary was the point of no return, binding their souls together in a way that neither bullets nor blood could ever sever. His confession hung in the air between them, fragile and monumental. The last of Luce's fear did not vanish, but it transformed, melting in the furnace of a truth more powerful than any threat. The walls were down. The boss was gone. Here, in this sanctuary, stood only Mark, a man, wounded and weary, offering her the most dangerous part of himself, his heart. She didn't answer with words. Words were currency from the world they had just escaped. Instead, she reached out and covered his hand, the one that had just brushed her tear, with her own. She laced her fingers through his, feeling the rough, bruised knuckles, the strength, the history of violence, and the startling tenderness he reserved only for her. It was all the answer he needed. A shuddering breath escaped him, a sound of pure, unadulterated relief. He leaned forward, resting his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. They stood like that for a long moment, two souls shipwrecked on the same impossible shore, drawing strength from the mere fact of the other's presence. "I was so afraid," he whispered, his breath warm against her lips. "Not of them, but of this. Of what you make me feel. It's the one thing I cannot control." "Then stop trying," Lucy whispered back, her free hand coming up to cradle his jaw. She felt the tension there, the weight of a crown he had never wanted. "Just be here. With me. Now." When he kissed her this time, it was nothing like the first. That had been a collision of desperation and pent-up desire. This was a slow, deliberate claiming, a vow sealed not with words but with feeling. It was deep, soulful, and heartbreakingly tender. It was a kiss of surrender, of homecoming. His arms wrapped around her, pulling her flush against him, and she melted into the embrace, her own arms winding around his neck, holding on as if he were the only solid thing in a spinning universe. He led her to the bedroom, a space as serene and personal as the living room, dominated by a wide window looking out over the sleeping city. There were no more masks, no more roles to play. There was only the slow, reverent exploration of skin, the whisper of fabric falling away, and the profound intimacy of two people choosing each other against all reason, against all odds. Later, they lay tangled in the sheets, the city lights painting silver stripes across their bodies. Luce's head rested on his chest, her ear pressed against the steady, strong beat of his heart. His fingers traced idle patterns on her bare back, a touch of such possessive wonder it made her want to weep. "I will keep you safe, Lucy," he vowed into the darkness, his voice a low, resonant promise. "No matter the cost. This life, my world, I will build a new one for you, a better one." She lifted her head to look at him. In the dim light, his face was stripped bare of all its hardness. He looked young, at peace. She believed him, not because he was all-powerful, but because his love for her had become the central, unshakable truth of his existence. "I'm not afraid," she said, and she meant it. She kissed him again, a soft, lingering promise of her own. As dawn began to blush on the horizon, painting the sky in hues of rose and gold, they stood together at the window, wrapped in a single sheet. The city below was waking up, oblivious to the war that had been fought in its underbelly, unaware of the fragile, powerful peace that had been forged in a penthouse high above it all. Mark held her from behind, his chin resting on her head, his arms a protective cage around her. The future was a minefield of rival gangs, family politics, and the constant shadow of betrayal. But in that perfect, silent moment, none of it mattered. He had started with a secret crush, a dangerous fascination with the light she carried. It had led him through fire and blood, to a confession in the dark, and finally to this. A love that felt both like a sanctuary and the most thrilling danger he had ever faced. He turned her in his arms, his eyes serious now, but full of a fierce, unwavering light. "The world will still come for us, Lucy," he said, stating the inevitable truth. "They will test us. They will try to tear us apart." Lucy looked up at him, her own eyes clear and unafraid. She placed a hand over his heart, feeling its strong, steady rhythm beneath her palm, a rhythm that was now the soundtrack of her life. "Let them try," she said. A slow, genuine smile, the one from the photograph, finally touched his lips. It transformed his entire face, banishing the last of the shadows. He was Mark Park, the Mafia boss, but he was also her Mark. And as the sun finally broke over the skyline, flooding the room with light, he kissed her, sealing a pact that was stronger than any underworld code. A love born in shadows, destined to reign in the light, ready to face whatever storm came next, together. And so, their story ends, but another is just beginning. If your heart raced with every stolen glance and your breath caught with every dangerous twist. Subscribe for more tales of passion, power, and forbidden love. Like if Mark and Luce's story left you craving more. Share this with someone who believes love is worth risking everything for. Because in the shadows, another secret is waiting to be told.